so far we've talked a lot about making our code as functional as possible. So what basically that means, again, just to recap, is can be summed up by saying our functions don't have side effects, or our functions don't have a shared state. So they're not touching anything outside themselves. They're just using stuff based on the parameters that they get in, and then they just return something and without touching anything in the outside world. Now, there are of course cases where you can't have that, or that's very difficult to do, or don't want to do that. For example, let's say you want to read a file. Well, a file is going to be part of the outside world of your code, and so a function that's reading a file fundamentally can't not have a shared state. So it does have side effects in a sense. All right. Well, even if you accept that, let's think about how we can minimize how much that occurs in your code, and let's talk about why you'd want to do that. Let's go through this code here. Basically, I'm just trying to get the long pet names. Long pet names are pet names with a length greater or equal to 4, and I have them in a text file on the right. And as you can see, I'm reading from this text file. And then I'm splitting the pet names and so on, and then I'm applying a filter to get only the long pet names, and then I'm returning it to my main function. Now, if there's something that I would improve about this code, it's the following thing. We do have to read the file. That's true, and that's fine. But this thing happens in the middle of our code. So in the middle of our code, the file could not exist, or there's a bunch of problems that could happen. And that means that while this function is a pure function, this function is not a pure function, which means that this function isn't a pure function, and so on. And so my recommendation here would be, if you want your code to be as functional as possible, which does have its benefits, is to take all of the external state, all of the side effects, and move them up as far back as you can, so that you only have maybe one function that has external state. So let's see how we would do that. One very obvious way would be, instead of getting this file here, we can just split this, move this out into main, and we can just pass this into get pet names, get long pet names. So that's basically already taking a file, and now this is a pure function as well. We just moved one line of code, and now this is not a pure function, but every other function is. We can run it, and we can see that it still works. So it's getting Bobby, Timmy, and Stacy, and that's great. And now let's look at what the benefit of that is. Well, everything that is a bit harder to look at because it depends on some external system. And here I have the example of reading a file, but maybe it's making an HTTP request or reading from a database or something like that. Imagine if you were reading from a database right in here. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that could go wrong. Maybe your database connection failed. Maybe there's something wrong with your query and so on, which those are normal things. But we would like as much as possible to keep our functions in a way that when we look at them, we know 100% what's going on. So when we see this function, we know that nothing can go wrong, basically, more or less. I mean, we could be, the split could go wrong and so on, but we can easily see the problems that could occur because this function only depends on what's being passed into it, and it only returns something. It's not messing with some external state. Same thing can be said for this function. And so basically all of our impure stuff is in one place and is at the topmost place. So what we're doing is we have this functional component, and we're just wrapping it. We're wrapping it in this outside impure thing. And I think that's a really good way to go about it, because you don't have to worry about things failing or your file not existing or any kind of problem arising in any other place than this main function. And again, this applies to database requests, it applies to HTTP requests, it applies to reading files, or it applies to any kind of external state that you might have to touch. So that's just to say, if you've seen the previous videos and you were thinking, well, okay, but how do I make all my functions pure? Some of them you will be able to, some of them you won't be able to. But it's good to keep all of your impurities, as it were, in one place so that you can reason about them better. And if you want to follow a more functional programming style, and if you want your code to be a little bit cleaner, this is what I'd recommend.